So, what we want to cover in these slides is the foundations, what our authors call the foundations of American government. I might characterize it slightly differently as American political culture, the things that we believe as a people that shapes our politics in very fundamental ways. So, we will be talking about, in these slides, classical liberalism, not to be confused with modern liberalism, like Joe Biden or whatever. Get that out of your minds right now. This is a set of shared values that we all have as Americans. Classical liberalism, classical republicanism, which has a lot of overlap with classical liberalism, but does have subtle and important differences, and a genuine tradition of inegalitarianism. Something that's not our pride and joy as a people, but it is part of who we were, and therefore it is part of who we are. Issues that we struggle with yet today, right? You can never fully escape the past. All right, so that's what we're going to be covering here. Starting with, next slide, classical liberalism. All right, so the first element of our foundations section here is going to be classical liberalism. Basically a set of ideas handed down to us from a project called the 18th Century Enlightenment. Although some of those thinkers actually go far back as the 1600s, people like Thomas Hobbes and even John Locke. But it's called, for whatever reason, the 18th Century Enlightenment, although some of it's 17th century. All right, so what are those ideas that influence us yet today and were foundational to our founding? This idea of competitive individualism and human reason. All right, let's break that down a little bit. Competitive individualism is the idea, number one, that the individual matters a very great deal. Government has to take the individual very seriously. Historically, that wasn't the case, by the way. For most of human history, individuals didn't really matter. The only thing that mattered were a small group of elites. Right? So this is a revolution in that thinking. Ordinary individuals matter a very great deal. They're front and center of our politics. Right? Government has all sorts of obligations to ordinary people. And individuals are very competitive with one another, right? Very competitive. Now look, let me distinguish here between the competitive vision of a Thomas Hobbes and his magnum opus, Leviathan. He said, in the state of nature, in the absence of government, life is nasty, solitary, brutish, and short. He has a dark vision for the state of nature. Right? They were always trying to murder each other, basically. And he said, well, since the problem of the state of nature is extreme, we need to enter into a social contract in which we create a government that is very powerful, that he called Leviathan, monstrously large, right, to restrain people's murderous impulses. Ooh, that's a lot to take. John Locke comes along a little later and goes, calm down, cool your jets, Tommy boy. The state of nature is problematic, but it's problematic. It's not catastrophic. People are a bit selfish, right, a bit biased in favor of their own point of view, their own interests. And that's problematic. You can't resolve disputes in a fair and equitable way under that condition of the state of nature. So we do enter into a social contract with one another to create a government, but that is a government of limited power. We'll get to that in a moment. That is a government of limited power to solve a limited problem of an inconvenient state of nature. It's not catastrophic. So we've gone right down John Locke's road, thankfully, and not the road sketched out by Thomas Hobbes. So that's the idea there of competitive individualism. And then human reason, right? Human reason and rationality over faith. Throughout most of human history, faith in religious entities and a belief in sort of mythology and superstition and the idea of witches and gods on Mount Olympus and all of that, right? That was most of human history. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, right, there's a growing sense here that that's not the way forward. That's not the way to achieve progress, that we have to make better sense of the world around us, both the natural world and the political world. We need to apply human reason and rationality, not faith and superstition and mythology. Right? There's still room for religion and faith under this approach, right? But it becomes less central and more marginal, quite honestly. Now, if you want to look at why we are becoming today in the Western Hemisphere more and more secular and less religious, the roots are here, quite honestly. All right, science, if you will, over religion. Number 2, how to organize the economy. 2 related ideas: relatively free markets and private property. Relatively free markets. That comes to us from a guy by the name of Adam Smith. His magnum opus was published in the year 1776, interestingly enough, and it was called The Wealth of Nations, in which he argued that we should organize our economy using relatively free markets. He was arguing not against socialism, which wasn't even a thing back then. He was arguing against mercantilism. Right, the tendency for countries to implement trade policies that were selfish and oriented towards helping your country and hurting every other country. Mercantilism, right? Put tariffs on imports to limit imports to protect your home industry. Quotas on imports to protect your home industry. Subsidies for exports to make it easier to export goods and services across the globe to produce a positive balance of trade for that country. Right? But the problem is, right, if every country across the globe does that, it becomes super problematic. It starts to impede global trade. So Adam Smith said, don't do it, right? Politically, it's tempting, right? Your own people are going to tell you, we want mercantilism. We want you to protect us at the expense of people in other countries. Even today, right, that's a real thing across the globe. But he argued against that and said, no, that impedes global trade and it impoverishes everybody, right? The wealth of nations comes from global free trade, not mercantilism. So we've taken that to heart, haven't we? Maybe more so than any other country in the world today. Relatively free markets is the way to organize our economy, certainly domestically. And, you know, look, do we still have mercantilist policies just like every other country? Sure. But, you know, the idea is we try to minimize that. And then, Smith also argued, look, free markets channel selfish behavior by the individual, right, the desire to get ahead in the world economically. It channels that energy in ways that are economically productive and produce tremendous economic growth. And those benefits trickle down to everybody to at least some degree, you know, without being naive about it. You know, to at least some degree, it trickles down to everybody. And that's how you create a wealthy society, right? The invisible hand of the market channels individual selfishness into larger benefits for the country as a whole, right? How can we afford a decently large welfare state today here in America? Because we have a productive economy. All right. And then as well, right, the linked issue of private property. Super central for a country that wants to have a good economy to protect private property. Right? Because if a government doesn't protect private property, why would individuals invest their labor into their property if they can't keep most of the benefits of that labor? Right? If you put all your work into an acre of land growing crops one year, and then other people move in at the end and steal all your crops, and that's okay, right? That reduces your incentive to do that the next year. So how do you incentivize people to work hard? Protect private property, right? And Locke goes further and says, boy, private property is so central that it's one of those fundamental rights that we possess by dint of our Creator, right? That we are endowed by our Creator with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. That's how central it is. And if government doesn't adequately protect it, we have the right to revolution and rebellion. Maybe bloody, hopefully not, but probably more nonviolent through elections in which we get rid of one government that's failed to protect property and create, right, put into place a government that will protect it. Number 3, what is classical liberalism? Limited government, right? Limited government. You do want the economy to be organized mostly in a free market way that puts most of the economic power in private hands, not the government's hands. Right? Limited government. Look, we have a regulatory government that does regulate the market, right? And we do have a government that has a welfare state to help we the people from falling through the cracks, right? But you try to limit that government as much as is feasible, and that's a matter for contest, right? But limited government. You don't want government to be too powerful. You don't want any institution to be too powerful. You don't want corporations to be too powerful, but you also don't want the government to be too powerful. You want it to be powerful enough to get things done, right, and do good things for we the people. But you also want to limit that power. And then finally, and very broadly, right, classical liberalism, not to be confused with, Joe Biden is a liberal and that kind of thing, but classical liberalism, values that we all share, albeit we all have our own version of exactly what it is. Optimism about the future, right? That if we have competitive individualism and we use our human reason and we have relatively free markets and we protect private property and we have limited government, if all those things are in place, we will achieve tremendous progress over time on into the indefinite future. Right? The idea that in general we make progress over time if we adhere to these values and institutions that we've just talked about. So to continue our discussion of the various elements of American political culture, the first one we talked about, right, was classical liberalism. Now we're going to talk about classical republicanism. Present at the founding of the American Republic and still an important part of our culture today. And it does overlap quite a bit with liberalism. And again, don't conflate this with like the modern Republican Party or anything, right? These are values we all share. Classical republicanism. Number one, civic virtue among we the people. Right? That's kind of a mindset of how we should conceptualize politics. And the argument is that to some extent, classical liberalism focuses too much on the individual and what they want for themselves, and it focuses too little on what's good for the larger community. Right? So that's the emphasis here, that we the people, elected officials, all of us, we should think primarily in terms of what's good for the community, right? Which may not always be what's good for the individual. But the argument is, it is civically virtuous to conceptualize politics in communitarian terms. All right? All right, so there's that. Second, this idea of separation of powers as a way to limit the power of the federal government. Right? And we've talked about this before. But it's the idea that we limit the power of the government by dividing up the power at the federal level into three branches: the judicial branch, the legislative, the executive. Right? And by splitting up that power, you fragment the power and you create a system of checks and balances where you do not concentrate power too much in any one institution of governance. All right? So much like as with classical liberalism, right? A belief in limited government, and then subsequently, this is how you execute that vision through separation of powers, checks and balances. And, there's really another level to that too that we don't often talk about. But federalism, right? Federalism is also part of that fragmentation of power, right? Because we put some power at the national level, some at the state level, some at the local level. You limit power by fragmenting it and dividing it up into different pots. Third, individualism, still valued under classical republicanism. Classical Republicans do value the individual and the importance of the individual, much like classical liberalism, but they do caution that you should always balance that with concern about the well-being of the larger community. Or don't just be selfish. Right, so I guess classical Republicans in that sense might be somewhat skeptical, right, of the logic of a free market, which just says, pursue your individual self-interest, let the devil take the hindmost, and it'll eventually work out. Right, it'll produce beneficial social effects. A classical republicanism says, no, it's not quite that simple. I'm not going to let you off the hook that easily. individuals need to think about what's good for the community in addition to what's good for them. And then fifth and finally, power to the people, right? Popular sovereignty via elected representatives. Indirect democracy, not direct democracy. And we've talked about that already, right? So that's another element here of classical republicanism. The third and final part of talking about American foundationalism is inegalitarianism, right? So we've talked about classical liberalism, we've talked about classical republicanism. Now I want to talk about inegalitarianism. We have a tradition here, right, in America. And look, every country is going to have its own tradition of inegalitarianism, and you know, we'll talk here about the American version of that tradition. Right? It's not something that we are proud of, but it would be naive and problematic to not fully acknowledge it, right? Because history lives in us today. Right? There's no way to fully escape our past, and we need to acknowledge that. It does no good to pretend it didn't happen or to say, well, that was in the past, we're completely free of that. That's not real. That's not real. So, something we need to talk about. So we do have these various traditions. I'll just lay out some of them here. Some of these are covered in the book quite nicely, others not, at least not in this chapter, although I think they do come back to it in the chapter on civil rights. So we'll explore that more fully then, but we want to introduce it now. Number one, white women, right? White women. The Founding Fathers, we know, treated women as inferior in critical ways, as intellectually inferior, as temperamentally inferior, and not worthy of being given the right to vote. Right? So at the inception of the Republic, although the Constitution was silent on this issue, they did delegate voting to the states for the most part. And what all 13 states did at the beginning was to fence women out of the right to vote. Right? Women didn't get that right guaranteed until the early 20th century through a constitutional amendment. There's a famous line from a letter that Abigail Adams had written to her husband, John Adams, who at the time was headed to the convention in Philadelphia to draft the Constitution. And she said, don't remember, John, remember the ladies, right? Remember the ladies. And I guess the founders did remember the ladies, but not in a good way. They fenced them out of politics. How many women were at that convention? Obviously none at all. So we've got that tradition, right? And look, have women made a lot of progress since then? Absolutely, right? Gained the right to vote in the early 20th century. You get that so-called second wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s, right? Addressing issues like sexual harassment in the workplace, domestic violence, divorce law, inequality in wages and access to the workplace. And then a more modern version of that, perhaps, with the Me Too movement. Right, but ongoing questions about, are the genders genuinely equal today? Are they? And look, gender issues, we'll see, can extend as well, right, to issues that affect the LGBTQ community. Clearly a hot battleground these days. So there's a deep tradition there, right? And it's why we struggle with it today. A lot of progress, right, but work to be done, arguably. Number two, blacks. Boy, what could be more obvious than that, right? It is often said that America was born in original sin, and the apple that we bit, right, was the apple of slavery. That started in 1619 when the first black people from Africa were brought here to serve as slaves. And it's funny, at the beginning, slavery in America was not strongly racialized. You had some white slaves, you had some white indentured servants, you had some free blacks, you had indigenous slaves, you had free indigenous people. Slavery at inception was relatively fluid, but by the latter half of the 1600s, slavery as an institution, as an economic institution, a cultural institution, a political institution, it became increasingly and intensely racialized to apply only to black people. All right. And of course, by the founding in 1787, that was set in stone, and it gets built right into the Constitution. We'll talk about that in Chapter 2. So that's something that we still struggle with today. Now look, we do have the Civil War in 1860. The U.S. prevails in that war, defeats the treasonous Confederacy. The Southern states are brought back into the fold, and we expunge slavery through things like the 13th Amendment. And then we have Reconstruction. Right? But sadly and tragically, Reconstruction fails after about a dozen years. President Rutherford B. Hayes pulls the military out of the South, which had been enforcing things like the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and other federal civil rights laws. And once the troops come out, all hell breaks loose, and the white South reasserts its authority over black people, and you get Jim Crow, right? Systematic deprivation of voting rights for black people, systematic segregation, systematic discrimination, systematic lynchings by the KKK. So that all falls apart, very sadly, and we go backwards with a vengeance. And then we revisit it, right, in the 50s and 60s through the Black Civil Rights Movement. And we do get landmark legislation like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. All right, and that's progress, no question. Right? Some call that our second Reconstruction, way more successful than our first one. But right, work to be done. We know that from the Black Lives Matter movement, that we have ongoing racial inequalities in all sorts of ways, in education, in employment, in income, access to health care, lifespan, all of these things, right, that we still struggle with, right? It's what we've inherited from our troubled past of inegalitarianism. Third, the indigenous peoples of America. That's quite a story. We'll tell more of it in the chapter on civil rights, right? But indigenous people. I think when white settlers first arrived here in small numbers, the indigenous people were, numerous and well organized and a force to be reckoned with. And in that sense, white people had a relatively positive view of indigenous people as a force to be reckoned with. As perhaps their equal even, right? But pretty quickly, the indigenous population was decimated primarily through the transmission of diseases from Europeans, for which the indigenous people had no immunity, so they got wiped out in massive numbers very quickly. And white people, right, from the West kept coming and coming and coming. I mean, the Western Hemisphere, from Great Britain and some other European states. And so the power imbalance started to switch over time. And as white people became more numerous and indigenous people became less numerous, white people got increasingly contemptuous of indigenous people as inferior, right? Culturally inferior, intellectually inferior, religiously inferior, technologically inferior. So worthy of being treated badly in the pursuit of scarce resources as whites migrated west. Right, and indigenous tribes got pushed west over and over and over and over again. And it's a harsh, brutal, terrible history. And by the late 19th century, the indigenous people had effectively been subjugated and moved west. And I think today indigenous people, amazing that they're still around, quite honestly, but they are still around indeed, have clung tenaciously. Here in America, about 1.5% of our population is indigenous. Some live on reservations, some don't. Some are strong members of tribes, others maybe less so. But in many ways, if you look at basic measurements of quality of life, indigenous people as a group tend to be at or near the bottom of America's racial and ethnic hierarchy. So there's quite a story to be told there that we still struggle with today. All right. Religious minorities of all sorts, right? Jewish people, Mormons, Catholics. Yeah, people often forget this today, but Catholics used to be considered an invading horde from places like Ireland and Italy. They were looked upon contemptuously by native-born Protestants who saw them as an alien threat. So they faced systematic discrimination for many decades because of their religious identity. So there's that tradition as well, right? And we still struggle with it today to some degree. Now, we have become a lot more secular. Religion is no longer all that central for most people, so that's de-escalated the conflicts. But there are still some conflicts there that roil our politics from time to time. Japanese Americans, and I add these. The first, I think, three were covered well by our book. I threw in 4, 5, 6, and 7 as a non-comprehensive set of additions. Japanese Americans, think about their treatment after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. In what was that, 1941, I believe? About 100,000 Japanese Americans, 3/4 of them citizens here, were forcibly relocated to internment camps across the Mojave Desert, for the most part, in the American Southwest, against their will. Had they done anything to warrant that? Hell no. Had done nothing, other than being of Japanese descent. Right? The fear by the American people, white people basically, was that Japanese Americans, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, might be more loyal to the Japanese emperor than to America, and so preemptively they were carted away. And it's a terrible chapter in our history. It's another example of our tradition of inegalitarianism. Chinese immigrants. It is estimated that about 90% of the labor force working on the Trans-Pacific Rail Line through the Sierra Nevada mountain range, this would have been immediately pre- and post-Civil War, so mid to late 19th century, was labor performed by Chinese immigrants, recruited here for that purpose. While they were building it, white Americans thought of them as an industrious, hardworking people. Once that line was completed through the Sierra Nevada, very dangerous work, a lot of people died. They used primitive technology, a lot of gunpowder, to blast tunnels through the Sierra Nevada. They were treated very hostilely, if that's even a word, treated with great hostility by white Americans who were like, okay, your work is done. Why are you still here? You people suck. Right? And that's why you end up with Chinatowns in places like San Francisco, Reno, San Diego, and so on. Right? It was a way for Chinese immigrants during this backlash after the building of the Trans-Pacific Rail Line to protect themselves by gathering together in community. So some of it was that, and some of it, right, was just plain old sort of segregationist policies by white people to make sure that Chinese immigrants lived in one part of the city and didn't sort of integrate with white people. I believe the Chinatown in Reno was ultimately burned to the ground by the government. Talk about hostility towards the Chinese immigrants. So that's another part of our inegalitarian tradition. And then finally, and I have a really good radio program there that you can click on if you're looking at the PowerPoint version of these slides. Mexican Americans in the American Southwest. Quite a history of inegalitarianism there. Related in part to the Mexican-American War and the results of that. So check that out. And what you have here, right, is a tradition in the American Southwest for many decades, and I think we struggle with it yet today, a history of discrimination, segregation, and even lynchings. All right, lynchings. Another part, right, of our inegalitarian tradition. Now, look, I'm high on America for the most part. But I think if we're going to be as good as we can be, we got to acknowledge our faults and address them forthrightly and not sort of cover them up and pretend it's all gone away and it's in the past and therefore not a problem. No, the past lives in us today, and we'll always struggle with that to some degree. But I think the important thing is that we struggle with it and come to grips with it in forthright fashion.